I think it's fair to say that the Persona series is now one of the most acclaimed and beloved JRPG franchises on the planet. It's been steadily gaining popularity with the release of each new installment, particularly since Persona 3, with its engaging mix of day-to-day high school life and dungeon crawling, all mixed up in a complex jumble of Jungian psychoanalysis and world mythologies. So, what better time than now, in the series' very extended 25th anniversary year, to figure out how the layered storytelling and character dynamics of these games can best inform us as DMs. I should say at the beginning that this video will solely cover Persona 3, 4 and 5, including Golden and Royal content. I haven't played 1 or 2 enough to have much to say about them, and the spin-offs are largely irrelevant for my purposes here. I'm also going to be spoiling all of those games as I go, though I will give some warnings as appropriate. The Persona series shares with the Trails series the honour of having some of the most richly detailed NPCs I've ever come across. Characters who feel like real people. In this instance by NPCs, I don't so much mean major recurring characters, but rather incidental characters standing around in streets and corridors, whom you can go through the whole game without interacting with at all. Many of them don't even have names, but what they do have is their own story. As the events of the game unfold, they're just living their lives in the background, going through their own struggles. Just to name a few of my favourites, there's the girl who's obsessed with Mitsuru in Persona 3, the old man who patrols the shopping district in Persona 4, the girl with the dog in Youngen Jaya in Persona 5, and of course, Riddle Senpai. Sometimes these NPCs will react to the events of the story, insofar as they're aware of those events, but more often their stories are completely divorced from the main plot. The sun-worshipping cultist in Station Square is certainly aware of the Phantom Thieves, but he just fits them into his own life, his own worldview, because that's what people do. No matter what world-shattering events are occurring, their lives continue, more often than not, without too much disruption at all. I think that's the key lesson here. All of the NPCs in your world have their own lives, independent of the PCs. From shopkeepers who only interact with the party once, to family members and spouses of the PCs, they should all feel like they continue to exist when the characters aren't speaking to them. The simplest way to do this is to have their circumstances change. The fortunes of their business go up or down, their friendships or romantic relationships alter or end. They go through bereavement, or welcome new life into the world. Or simply they grow and change. This is all dependent on the time spans at play, of course. But the basic principle is that the more your NPCs change as the story progresses, especially in ways unrelated to the party, the more real they will feel. Of course, this shouldn't be taken to extremes. They don't have to uncover buried treasure, or fall under a curse from a god or something. Just small, natural feeling changes. The kind that might not even necessarily come up, depending on how the party's next conversation with them goes. A little can go a long way. I've been more genuinely moved by random people who say 2 or 3 lines at a time in Persona games than I have been by the main characters in lots of other games. That's the kind of detail and characterization that I aspire towards. One of the key elements of the mainline Persona games since Persona 3 has been social links. Optional events in which the main character deepens their relationship with someone they know, whether that be a party member or just someone who's crossed their path in the course of daily life. These events are generally tied into the thematic material of the game. The Persona 3 ones, for instance, are largely about the characters finding meaning in their lives, while the Persona 5 ones tend to centre on the characters struggling against oppressive societal expectations or systems. In general, they're about giving a wider sense of the world, and a deeper understanding of a particular character. Until I did his social links, I just thought of Yosuke as a misogynistic homophobic prat. Once I'd gotten through his social link though, I realised he was a misogynistic homophobic prat filled with generalised resentment and operating under an inferiority complex. It's not exactly enough to make me like him, a position for which I will never apologise, but it does at least give me an appreciation of what it is that drives him. It makes him a richer character and explains many of his actions in the main story. And that's what social links are about broadly. They expand the world of the game and give you an insight into the daily struggles of the people around you, as well as building on the wider thematic material of the game. Now, all of this broad story stuff is all well and good, but one of the important things that Persona does from a game design perspective is to tie the building of relationships to specific mechanical benefits. Bonus XP in 3 and onwards, new abilities for party members in 4, and a whole range of inventive benefits tied to the characters in 5. It reminds me of a Matt Colville video, yes, him again, about rewarding the behaviour you want to see from players. If you spent a lot of time crafting your world and your NPCs, and they all fit together in interesting and nuanced ways, then you obviously want your players to explore that and appreciate your hard work. So, you need to give them incentives to do so. In that Colville video, he talks about using quest cards with a specific goal and reward. I'm not convinced you need to be that direct and explicit, although by all means do so if you think it'll help, but make sure the players understand that interacting with NPCs and finding out more about them will have rewards. Those rewards could just be gaining allies, of course, maybe even aid in combat, but you might want to take a leaf out of Persona 5's book. As I've mentioned, the social links in that game give the main character a range of benefits tied to the people involved. So the shogi player teaches you strategy, the unethical teacher gives you time off in class to do various things, Gun Dad modifies your weapons, Embezzlement Dad teaches negotiation skills. You get the idea. So what mechanical benefits might NPCs be able to offer your players? Maybe a wizard can teach or otherwise grant access to certain spells. Essek in Campaign 2 of Critical Role is a good example of this. Or a thief can instruct a character over time to give them proficiency with thieves' tools. Ideally, this kind of benefit should be something very concrete and clearly advantageous. If you're stuck, check the Marks of Prestige section in the 5e DM's guide for some inspiration, so to speak. There is a drawback to the social link approach though, which is evident in the Persona games themselves. Despite the fact that these are games which, especially in 4 and to a lesser extent 5, involve delving directly into people's psyches, they have a bad habit of restricting character development and backstory exploration to these optional events. Let's take Rise from Persona 4. Rise is a brilliantly layered and complex character, and her social link is one of my favourites in the game, revolving around her attempting to reconcile contradictory desires and exploring whether or not she even has a true self. But if you don't do that social link, she could very easily come across as just a flirty, slightly pushy airhead, because that's how she often presents herself. You miss out on an awful lot from not doing social links, particularly where those social links only become available late in the game, like Haru's in Persona 5, when there are a lot of demands on your time. The expanded versions of both 4 and 5 have done some work to rectify this, by making certain parts of the story contingent on having completed certain social links, but they don't make this terribly apparent to the player, partly, to be fair, because to do so would be potentially spoilery. Of course, this is just generally something that you have to accept as a DM. A lot of the content that you prepare will turn out to be optional, and players will miss or skip it, often inadvertently. But, especially if you have a really important NPC whose rich character is vital to the story, try not to make all of the exploration of their backstory and the nuances of their character missable. Make sure the players have multiple ways to encounter these important character beats, and make sure they matter to what's going on overall. Otherwise, your players probably will just miss out on all that work you've done, which would be a shame for all concerned. For all this talk about characterization, which is something that Persona is famously good at, I think it's important not to overlook the central role of setting. Each of the three main games we're looking at here has a substantially different setting, which contributes to the overall feel of the game. Persona 3 takes place in Tatsumi Port Island, an artificial island with a very modern, tech-heavy feel to it, which makes sense for the noirish ambiance of P3. 4 brings us to Inaba, which I'll have much more to say about in a minute. A sleepy, quiet, semi-rural town of the kind you probably recognise if you've watched any anime. And 5 makes use of a real city, Tokyo, using mostly real wards and a mixture of real places, most obviously Shibuya Crossing and the National Diet Building, and fictional ones, to underscore its social commentary. The city feels busy and claustrophobic, the kind of place where people get lost and terrible things can happen, which is where the Phantom Thieves come in, of course. All of this is useful, if a bit basic. Matching the ambience to your setting to plot and tone is not exactly obscure storytelling advice. But where I think Persona really excels is in making these feel like real, lived-in places. Some of this comes from all that work with NPCs that I've mentioned earlier, but there's more to it than that. Let's go back to Inaba. As I've mentioned, Inaba is a small, peaceful town, all single-story houses, grassy riverbanks, and a single shopping street. But even before it's rocked by a series of murders, there are all sorts of tensions beneath the surface. Most notably, the conflict between the family-run artisan businesses of the shopping street and the new chain department store Junez, where, whatever Nanako might claim, every day is not great. These dynamics are present throughout the game. They're commented upon by various NPCs almost constantly, and they're implicit in the stories of various characters, most obviously Yosuke and Naoki, but also more subtly, Yukiko and Kanji. But even more importantly, the setting plays into the central tension and themes of the game. It becomes clear eventually that the kidnap victims, the people who show up on the Midnight Channel, are people who are subject to public attention and often malicious gossip, because they're at least somewhat known to many of the residents of the town, and they've recently come to public prominence. It's the kind of dynamic you couldn't get in the more anonymous large cities of Persona 3 and 5. But of course it also tells us something about what it's like to live in this town, and reinforces the central theming of the game and the series about the difference between external perception and interior reality. The plot is very much tailored to the setting, to the point that, skip forward to the time on screen if you don't want to be spoiled, even the motives of the two murderers in the game, Mitsuo and Adachi, boil down to frustration and boredom, which in Adachi's case is explicitly linked to the contrast between Inaba and the big city. It's a beautiful marriage between plot, theme and setting. Yes, it's a polycule. And an extraordinarily well-crafted setting, which develops believably throughout the story, as indeed do the characters that live there. And, like all good storytelling, this is instructive for D&D. The setting for your campaign, or even individual sessions, shouldn't be arbitrary. Everything from combat encounters to the difficulty of exploration, to NPCs, to just the general vibe of what's going on, should be tailored to it. I've talked before about how I love the cosmopolitan feel of port cities, but that's not going to come across if I make all the NPCs humans who only speak common. Conversely, if your party are struggling through the mountains, it shouldn't just feel like walking along a road. The physical difficulty of what they're doing should come across, perhaps in survival or athletics checks, maybe inventory management if you're that kind of group, and almost certainly in combat encounters, with flying monsters who make their home in the mountains. Something like peritons or griffins, which can do flyby attacks and harry your players like that. This might seem quite obvious, but it's so easy to overlook when you're caught up in worrying about where the campaign is going on a wider level, especially if your players are only spending a session or two in a particular setting or environment. And speaking of the wider story, just like with Inaba, the best plots dovetail with their settings. An urban game with lots of crime, betrayal and deception shouldn't take place in some kind of glimmering marble Minas Tirith style city. It's more likely to work in a dirty, run-down place where people struggle to get by. If you want to play in the Feywild, nature itself might be an obstacle, and the plot is likely to turn on how capricious, changeable and untrustworthy Fey creatures are. Incidentally, if you are interested in the Feywild, the best possible resource is Dale Kingsmill's videos on it, and she's really good on exactly this kind of thing, how setting can reflect wider ideas. You can even use changes in setting to reflect change or escalation in the campaign story, as I talked about in my Fallout New Vegas video. Depending on how player-led your campaign is, of course, it may not always be possible to plan this kind of thing perfectly, but you should always try to have at least some guiding ideas of what the setting is at any given time, and some key ideas associated with it, which you can then weave into the story. Back in my Zelda video, I talked about ways of building and customizing dungeons to fit particular settings and ideas. Certain of the Persona games do something like this, but on a much more abstract level than the water temples of Zelda. In Persona 5, and to a lesser extent Persona 4, dungeons represent the psyches of individuals, usually based around some distortion in how they view reality. So, Futaba, who's shut off from life and waiting to die, has a tomb. Yukiko, whose shadow is a fairy tale princess waiting for her prince, gets a European-style castle. Madarame, who plagiarizes his students' artworks, gets a gallery in which the students themselves are the artwork. You get the idea. What stands out here is that these are pretty high concepts, but they're also relatively simple. You can sum them up in a single word: pyramid, castle, gallery. And that will give you a pretty good idea of what they're going to look like and how they're going to feel. This kind of mixture of depth and simplicity is itself a great lesson in terms of keeping not only dungeons, but plot beats memorable. The basic idea should be very easy to grasp, but there may be a lot going on beneath that, feeding into it. Persona 5 goes quite a bit further with this conceptual approach than 4, in terms of the actual dungeon layouts and mechanics. 4 has some clever ideas, like the dungeon modelled after an 8-bit style RPG dungeon, or the one where your SP halves every time you get in a fight, but you'll notice that one of those is conceptual, and the other is mechanical, and there's not a huge amount of interplay between those two things. 5 comes closer to marrying them. For instance, Madarame's dungeon, or palace, features a section where you have to identify the real artwork amid a bunch of fakes, which reflects the fact that Madarame has painted a bunch of fake versions of this particular painting. Futaba's palace features lots of traps, collapsing floors, spikes and so forth, which is not only something we'd generically associate with pyramids, but also a reflection of the fact that Futaba won't allow anyone to get close to her due to her intense guilt. So the palace has become a way of literalizing abstract concepts, doing character work through setting and mechanics. Of course, you don't have to go quite this high concept in a D&D game, although I don't think it would be impossible. It's just a matter of making sure the concept of the dungeon is reflected mechanically. For instance, going back to Futaba's palace, it's one of the few dungeons I've ever played in any medium where the existence of traps and puzzles makes intuitive sense, because they're a manifestation of Futaba's defense mechanisms, but also her desire to be understood. So maybe the in-world designer of your dungeon put traps in to keep people out, or to test those who would venture in, or out of sadism, or some other purpose entirely. Whatever the case, you should do your best to make that purpose clear to the players through design. If it's sadism, maybe there are chambers in the dungeons that overlook the spike pit, or if it's a matter of testing, there might be congratulatory messages after each trap, or hints to the next one. This is where I think Persona can teach us different lessons to Zelda, as regards dungeons, in terms of psychology, fittingly enough. Even if your dungeon doesn't have a single named designer in-universe, somebody built it, maybe some ancient culture, and so the design of it can tell the players something about that culture. Maybe the stonework is extraordinarily smooth, bespeaking that culture's mastery of masonry. Or there could be artworks in there that represent important parts of that culture's history. Best of all is if you can tie this to game mechanics or challenges. Maybe parts of the dungeon are underwater, which tells us something about the history of the dungeon, but it also presents the players with a specific challenge. Even the kinds of monsters who populate the dungeon are significant. If there's a Mind Flayer colony in there, that's a pretty obvious clue as to what might have happened to the original builders or inhabitants. And the presence of various kinds of undead can tell all kinds of stories in and of itself. This all dovetails, as you might have gathered, with what I was talking about with setting previously. In that dungeons are also an important storytelling tool, and one that's an inherent part of the game, one of the Ds. And really, a dungeon is just a specialised setting for a specific purpose. Just as a warning at the top, if you don't want to be spoiled for the endgames of Persona 3, 4 and 5, I'd recommend skipping over this section entirely and going straight to the conclusion. There's a recurring plot device in the Persona games where antagonists prove to be part of a greater chain, usually with some kind of supernatural presence at the end of it. In other words, human antagonists turn out to be harbingers or servants of metaphysical ones. So in Persona 3, Strega and, more directly, Ikutsuki act as heralds of Nyx, ensuring her coming and ultimately guarding the way to her. In Persona 4, Namatame, the kidnapper, is being set up by Adachi, the real murderer, and both of them are ultimately being manipulated by Izanami as part of a wider test of humanity. In Persona 5, most of the palace rulers turn out to be connected to Shido, who has been set up as the true villain since the first flashback to the protagonist's arrest. But this is all ultimately revealed to be the doing of Yaldabaoth, and part of an ongoing and very Shin Megami Tensei conflict between order and chaos. You'll notice that there's an escalation going on in all of these examples, from an earthly threat to a divine one. That's a good way to think about progression of threat over a long-running campaign, similarly to the tiers of play that I talked about in the New Vegas video. The threat builds through more and more powerful enemies, to ultimately reveal the big bad of the campaign, a greater power and a more universal threat. Now that said, the greater power doesn't have to be a god or an archdevil or anything like that. It can just be a more powerful entity, one whose plans threaten a wider area of the world. Dragons are a classic example, and it's always good to give your players a dragon or two in some capacity. They are the other D after all. And of course, you can introduce a god or some other supernatural entity without your players ever directly confronting them. Your party may not fight Orcus directly, but they can certainly thwart his plans and fight his lieutenants. What matters is that as the players grow more powerful, the scale of what they face grows, or is revealed to be greater than they believe. This doesn't mean that every enemy they face has to be connected, of course, but stringing together major villains in a way that feels like escalation can help to make the campaign as a whole feel more cohesive. One of the striking things about the Persona examples is that the mortal antagonists, certainly in 4 and 5, generally prove to have less control and influence than they think, since they're ultimately just part of a wider plan. Apart from P3's antagonists, who are consciously serving Nyx to greater or lesser extents, there is one major exception to this though. And here we get into spoilers for Persona 5 Royal's endgame, So again, skip to the conclusion if you don't want to be spoiled on Royal specifically. In Royal, after Yaldabaoth's defeat, the world reverts to a sort of idealised state where everyone has what they want, whether this be deceased loved ones coming back to life, or just the return of their sweet life on the track team. This ultimately proves to be the doing of school counsellor Takuto Maruki, who has inherited Yaldabaoth's power, and is using it to try to set the world to rights. The story shifts to being about a more apparently benevolent form of control, and the question of,
do I have the right?
Here we have something slightly different. A human character taking on the power of a god and using it to rewrite the world. It's another classic antagonistic archetype, and a strong indication that an overpowered individual can make for just as good a final antagonist as a supernatural being. What matters is that sense of escalation, of building up to something, and of paying off all of that build-up with something really spectacular, a threat that seems almost impossible to overcome. Like this big golem lad. The series excels at giving players a classic RPG adventure that unfolds against contemporary Japanese life, a mixture of the mundane and the extraordinary. While that specific dynamic is probably not something D&D is best suited to, although there are certainly other RPGs which are better suited, there's still a lot we can take away from the complex, nuanced characters and worlds of these games, and more importantly, how the player interacts with them. Thanks for watching. This particular series on learning D&D lessons for games is probably going to take a little break for a few months, while I focus on other things, including different kinds of video for this channel. But I'm planning a real whopper of a video, possibly in multiple parts, for when it comes back. So be sure to subscribe and check the playlist for past and future installments. As well as that, if you've enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like, and do share it around, particularly to any Persona and/or D&D enjoyers in your life. Until next time, goodbye, friends.